Hello, everyone, and welcome to the People's Forum. We are a political education space and cultural center based in New York City for working class internationalist movement building. My name is Tahia Islam, and I'm the education coordinator here in the space. Thank you for joining us as we round out our summer-fall series of the histories of the working class in North America. This series is an attempt to bring researchers and scholars to learn lessons from past organizing and to advance our class struggle today. So far, we have heard about Appalachian women's organizing at coal mines, Indigenous labor struggles, international solidarity building between dock workers from San Francisco to South Africa, and much more. You can see the rest of our lectures from this series on our YouTube channel. And if you did like this series, please leave a comment below and let us know what else you want to hear and learn more about. Today, I am grateful to have with us Carrie Freshour, scholar and historian on poultry workers in the South and its connection to incarceration, prisons, and abolitionist futures. As an introduction, Carrie Freshour is a Southerner, abolitionist, and assistant professor of geography at the University of Washington. Her work focuses on low-wage food and agricultural labor in the U.S. South, racial capitalism, carceral geographies, and the Black radical tradition. Freshour is currently finalizing her book project, Making Life Work, which centers the experiences of Black women, their families, and broader communities in Northeast Georgia who remain the basis for the global production of cheap chicken. She teaches courses on qualitative methods, food and agriculture, racial capitalism, and the radical geographies of the PNW. She's a part of several research and organizing collectives, including the People's Geography of Seattle, the Antipod Sound Collective, Study and Struggle, and Abolitionist Organizing in WA State. Today, we will hear from Carrie and then open up to Q&A. So please, if you're here listening, please use the YouTube chat to leave questions throughout the session. And I'll pass it over to Carrie for the next hour-ish.
Thank you, Tahia, and hi, everyone. Thanks for allowing me to spend some time with y'all today. Let's see. I think I'm ready to share this screen, David. Great. Okay. Wonderful. So yeah, my name is Carrie Freshour. I'm calling in from Creek and Cherokee lands, also known as Athens, Clarke County, Georgia. My heart and life's work remain in the U.S. South in rural North Georgia, and in a place I'm building relationships to and learning so much from. That's the Mississippi Delta. I have some friends calling in today or viewing today. So I shared 2 papers with the cohort for y'all. The first piece was published through Monthly Review in a special issue on racial capitalism printed in July last year, alongside a group of scholars I deeply respect. And in that piece, I tried to grapple with the connection suddenly made visible across poultry plants and prisons as COVID-19 hotspots, but in a way that looked beyond the surface of the concentrated and often state-sanctioned outbreaks. The second is a co-authored piece with my longtime friend and comrade, Brian Williams. It will be published hopefully soon in Food and Foodways and is part of a special issue on carceral foodways, co-edited by Ashante Reese and Joshua Sabika. So Brian Williams is at MSU, living and working in Starkville, Mississippi. This piece allowed us to think about the longer history that shapes the relationships I was struggling through in the Monthly Review piece, and both reflect how social movements have shifted the possibilities of my thinking. And writing, I hope, with movements, artists, organic intellectuals, and the changing politics of struggle for freedom and liberation. So today's talk will consist of 3 major parts. First, I'll provide some context on the place, the study, and this larger book, and now documentary short project with some friends and collaborators in Athens, Georgia. Next, I'll provide a quick history of working class struggle within the industry using archival evidence from across the U.S. South. And throughout, I'll try to historicize connections across plantations, prisons, and the poultry plant as sites that extend what Ruth Wilson Gilmore calls carceral geographies. Those are sites necessary for racial capitalism, but And finally, I'll conclude with some preliminary thoughts informed by abolitionist organizing about the connections of working class struggle, food movements, and abolition of prisons and beyond. So I study race, place, and labor in the US South through a focus on poultry production. And I imagine many of you have heard of the poor working conditions within plants. Labor advocates, unions, and even environmental and food justice activists have long advocated for changes to the conditions of work, the rate of production within this industry. And yet conditions have only continued to worsen in the production of cheap meat. And this seems like a glaring contradiction to me, something I wanted to understand deeply, not only what takes place today inside plants, but also how it came to develop in the way that it did, where it did, and why not another way. So what does it mean to study race, place, and labor? Well, I'd like to start with labor. It's really easy to think about the working conditions, the paid work inside, and what happens to people's bodies, what happens in the tens of thousands of motions they have to make in a day, what happens in the disciplining of their work. But I also wanted to understand how conditions outside of work, or how life's work, as some feminist geographers have put it, also shapes women's work within the plants. And this starting place, I think, resonates well with Jessie Wilkerson's talk, who you may have heard speak a few months ago. So in many ways, my research is about labor inside the plants and the production of cheap chicken, but it's also about how intergenerational working class and largely Black families make life work in mostly rural places, in a political world that is anti-Black, anti-labor, and anti-life. And to understand these conditions how these conditions outside of work came to be, I had to study the history of the place and the relationship of place to ideas of race and racial practices. The perspective learned from workers not only critiques the current way of doing things, but they also help us all imagine and build towards living otherwise. So my study of Georgia is part of this larger focus on the US South. And this isn't incidental or just because it's the place where I'm from. As Clyde Woods argues, the South holds an important regional influence, emboldening an expression of white supremacy that has set the path for the rest of the country. So as the South goes, so goes the nation. Rather than seeing the South as exceptional or backward, racial politics within the South and subsequent social and economic politics paved the way for a world increasingly less free and ecologically degraded. Lessons from the South can teach us a great deal about the future of this country and the world. And the Black working class experience in the South directly has challenged this myth of meritocracy and the American dream, while at times setting a path for liberation from racial capitalism. So through this deep study of regions, how they are made and remade, we might trace the set of relations, ideas, and institutional power congealed in what Clyde Woods calls the plantation block. So here we see dominant forms of plantation power that live on, reproducing themselves after the abolition of slavery, from cotton to chicken. And in Georgia, I've traced a direct genealogy across these two industries. Today, poultry shapes the trajectory of economic development for much of the region while speeding up workers' lives through premature disability and death. To do all of this, I draw on archival and ethnographic work, and I'm lucky to work alongside a few community organizations and organizers who remain grounded in the region and continue to fight for liberation today. So why Georgia? Georgia has produced more poultry than any other state for the last 36 consecutive years, and poultry remains the state's largest ag product. Production across the state has more than tripled since 1978 to meet exponential growth in per capita consumption across the US and around the world. Yet it's no coincidence that the state, the self-declared poultry capital of the world, also proudly boasts a competitive advantage for manufacturing their extremely low unionization rates, so at below 3%, and the lowest average of all hourly poultry processing wages. So pre-COVID, this was an average of $9.54 an hour, 40% lower than on manufacturing jobs. Based on existing research and popular and policy-oriented reports, the industry is often depicted as one made up of mostly immigrant and largely undocumented workers from Mexico and Central America. The picture of extremely high turnover rates, always above 100%, the threat of ICE raids, and debilitating work also frame common perceptions of the industry. So even among local activists and community leaders within Athens, Georgia, which is where most of my research takes place, most believe the plants were full of Latinx immigrants. Yet I found something very different happening while working in Georgia's largest plant. So through the interplay of immigration raids, industry compliance, and anti-immigration laws, the industry returned to a reliance on a majority US-born Black workforce. So how did Georgia become the poultry capital of the world, and what was its relationship between this industry, Black women workers, and expanding carceral geographies? So I'm going to play this clip for y'all by Abbott Massey, who's the former president of the Georgia Poultry Federation.
And some of this hilly country in northeast Georgia, as you know, is not good for crops, but the climate is great. And there were a lot of innovative people. Jesse Jewell, as you mentioned, being one of the key ones. But the commercial broiler industry developed rapidly at that point, and chickens were shipped by train to New York and other places from Gainesville and other places in Georgia. But it began to grow, and Jesse conceived the idea of growing chickens under contract. His family had a small hatchery and feed store, and so early on, I'm told, he gave chickens, baby chicks, to farmers who would raise them, and then they sold the feed to them. Then he came up with the idea of the contract system, so that the company would provide the baby chicks and the feed. The family farm would provide the house and the equipment and the labor. The company would provide some technical assistance, and that helped the industry grow rapidly, and it allowed the companies to have some quality control over their product. So it has grown dramatically over the years. The growing time has been reduced from 16 weeks or so down to 7 or 8 weeks. A larger chicken is grown, a 3.5 pound bird in 6 weeks or so, and larger birds are grown now. Not as much feed is used per pound. It's dropped from over 4 pounds required to raise a pound of chicken to less than 2 pounds now. Mortality reduced. So it has become a major industry, the largest segment of agriculture and of agribusiness in Georgia.
13 billion I hear.
13 billion a year.
Okay, so that clip is part of an oral history collection at UGA, and I apologize, but I sped it up a little bit to play for y'all. He has this really long Southern drawl. But Abbott Massey's words represent the dominant narrative about the poultry in Georgia. It tells a story of a few entrepreneuring white men who innovated the industry from something housewives did to make a little extra money to the multi-billion-dollar industry it is today. Abbott Massey, who you just heard, is featured in this photo here with the arrow, standing second from right. And this photo, for me, captures some of the racial politics of the time at the convening of the National Chicken Council in Gainesville, Georgia in 1961. And I've alluded to the relationality of these concepts of race, place, and labor. And place and race are so tightly intertwined for me. So racism isn't just about racial minorities, studying or counting Black and brown folks, but is a way to think about what Ruth Wilson Gilmore calls the fatal couplings of power and difference. And that is, again, to think about how we undo those. My goal is to understand how these regional structures are race, but also how race becomes regionalized, shaping ideas about who is deserving and undeserving, and how these ideas come to be materially experienced, felt, reproduced, resisted, and even refused. So specifically, this means asking a different set of questions for understanding the growth of the industry and the production of place. So how is it that some places, like the places where prisons and poultry plants are built, rely on racist and ecologically destructive solutions as a path to economic development? To do this, Brian and I traced the longer history, so that's Brian Williams, of the South's dependence on plantation agriculture as plantation elites reorganized themselves after the abolition of slavery. And they did so through land monopolization and racial violence, what Du Bois terms the counter-revolution of property, and reinstated the racist exploitation of workers as a pillar of plantation agriculture, so that by the late 19th century, the plantation South was characterized by massive monopolized land holdings and and coercive relationships of labor, as well as a single crop economy and ecology built on cotton. Plantation landscapes in the South were at the forefront of both racial violence and the chemical industry expansion. And here again, I'm drawing from Brian's work. So Brian studies what he calls agro-environmental racism, and these are race-based regimes of labor, monopolization of land, and the production of hunger that work to normalize pesticide exposure in the Mississippi Delta. And Parchman Farms, the Mississippi State Penitentiary itself, is part and parcel of this practice of plantation agriculture. So part of a system of agricultural experimentation and development through state control of land and the work of folks incarcerated inside. So the walls and fences of prisons such as Mississippi's Parchman serve both as sites of confinement and control and a reminder that these carceral legacies are very much alive. To see grounded writing on this, I suggest reading folks like Jasmine Moore, who talks about the role of Parchman on Black Mississippians' everyday lives. But fields without prisons are also the product of technologies oriented toward carceral relations for the control of life and land. So Ruth Wilson Gilmore, again, through her concept of carceral geographies, argues that, quote, a prison is not just a building over there, but a set of relationships that undermine rather than stabilize lives everywhere. So with that in mind, how have carceral geographies shaped the development trajectory of the US South? One, as Clyde Woods reminds us, is dependent on cheap labor, oriented towards continued monopolization of land and resources, and rooted in the opposition to Black freedom. This history and set of relations shapes present-day worker struggles within the poultry industry. And to draw these connections, I focus on how workers tell this story. This doesn't mean that I throw white elites like Jessie Jewell and Don Tyson out, but instead I critically read their arguments for subtext and ideas shaping not only their individual actions, but actions of a larger plantation bloc and the struggles over economic development in the region. So now I'll turn to an overview of this history of worker organizing and action. This is probably what folks in the People's Forum are most interested in, right? So this is a bit of a lightning round of the history of worker organizing within the industry. So going back to Jessie Jewell, cited by Abbott earlier as the major innovator, Jewell's built Georgia's first processing plant in Gainesville, opening it in 1941. So the plant initially recruited workers among a rural population of mostly white women and a small number of Black women. And women came from cotton and tenant farming and sharecropping households, quote, out in the country of the surrounding areas, considered by Jewell and his VP here, Mr. Thurman, to be uneducated, unskilled, and desperate for work. And this excerpt is the result of an NLRB investigation of Jessie Jewell's plant over an organizing drive by amalgamated meat cutters and butcher workmen in the 1950s. So at that time, the industry remained majority white, with management placing Black workers in some of the dirtiest jobs. These were hanging live birds by their feet to be slaughtered, and draw hand, which is removing the internal organs by hand for inspection. And so these are photos from this Gainesville plant showing the two types of work, right? With mostly white women eventually moving to the further processing departments, while Black women on the left are in evisceration. Black workers were also brought in to displace organized white labor, so that by the 1960s, Black workers dominated the industry, especially positions tied to the line. And the industry's history is one of worker organizing, sometimes with the aid of the union, sometimes in more spontaneous and less formalized ways. For example, at Georgia Broiler in Gainesville, Miss Faye Bush, who's right in this photo, and many of you might know her from her founding of the Newtown Florist Club, which is an environmental justice organization in Gainesville. She was interviewed in 2002 by Professor Carl Weinberg and his students at the University of North Georgia. And she recalls a time in the early 60s when a group of, quote, mostly Black women walked off the line in protest against heat. She looks back on the walkout, both noting the fear that workers had, but also the deliberateness of the action, which she had to clarify for Professor Weinberg, right? So here she says, no, he's asking, so you would just walk off to get some air? And Miss Bush says, no, we called ourselves going to have a walkout, right? So she declares strongly that it was a protest. labor discipline during this early days of the processing industry was a major problem for plant management. So as you say, with spontaneous actions like the one Ms. Bush describes, but also through the form of absenteeism. So in a plant of 240 workers, where 95% of those workers were Black, Jean Masters, who was interviewed by Professor Weinberg and his students, talks about the need to regularly control their time, workers' time, and to work against absenteeism. He called this weekend hangovers, where workers would come in on Monday after the weekend, sometime around noon or 1, when they felt like they could come back. There's also this kind of funny story in the oral history where the boss tries to get all these workers fired, and so he tells Masters, fire the group of workers who come in late, the next group of workers who do this. And Masters tries, but then realizes that it's one of the best draw hands on the line. And when he does that, the boss then says, no, hire them all back. We can't fire them, right? The leading industry publication out of Gainesville, called the Poultry Times, reported on this problem of absenteeism in 1972, stating, quote, "The light labor situation continues to be one of the main problems of the broiler industry in the Southeast," end quote. Industry leaders blamed high absenteeism on, quote, "governmental social programs and the willingness on the part of many employees to be satisfied with a minimum income level," end quote. So this practice of weekend hangover-induced absenteeism, or the ability to just take care of one's body when needed, mirrors historic patterns of workers' resistance in need of direct disciplining by the industry. Worker organizing has been a part of the industry's history since its inception, and by the late 1970s, union campaigns targeted poultry plants in the right-to-work state and the right-to-work South. So I'm still working to piece together the constellation of unionization drives, strikes, and walkouts within this industry. And these are photos of an amalgamated strike that took place in 1962 in Rose Hill, North Carolina, that are at the Georgia State University Southern Labor Archives. But with these photos is very little information, right? A date and unidentified workers. But one well-documented large-scale poultry strike occurred in February 1979 and lasted until December 1980 in Laurel, Mississippi at Sanderson Farms, which was led by, again, quote from news reports, mostly Black women. So the strike focused not on wages or overtime, but on the pace of work and rules that limited workers to 3 bathroom breaks per week. It also targeted charges of sexual harassment against male foremen. So during this almost 2-year strike, Black women made up 68 of the 80 women who remained loyal to the strike for the entire time. An ICWU spokesman, Bob Kaysen, explained the union's effort as representing a shift in organizing strategy. He said, quote, "We've believed for some time that we ought to be functioning with people who get banged around the most. That is, Blacks and women," end quote. And so that's from a news article from 1979. So at this time, national unions saw the necessity in organizing the South in the midst of deindustrialization and a decrease in real wages for most manufacturing jobs. Unlike other manufacturing industries, between 1983 and 1993, the industry actually expanded its workforce by almost 70%, opening 78,000 new positions. And this was a moment when it appeared that workers had some political power. In my field site, there was at least one major walkout during this time period, during contract negotiations without the support of the plant's union. This took place in 1978. So Valerie Reddy, Daily News staff writer, reported on the strike. She said, quote, "Around 50 disgruntled night shift employees at Gold Kiss Athens Poultry Processing Plant walked off the job Wednesday at 5:45 p.m. without the support of their union. They vowed not to end the wildcat strike until they were given $1 an hour pay raise, better benefits, and improved working conditions," end quote. So I was lucky enough to sit down with Teresa, who participated in this walkout. She was born in 1959 and grew up in a poultry family. Her mother worked at the plant for 26 years. She started working there right after high school, first doing vaccinations in the hatchery, and then she moved to the evisceration line and processing. And she recalls the walkout was about working conditions, most notably bathroom breaks and the lack of heat during winter. She remembers people fainting because no one would relieve them from the line. I'm going to play a short excerpt from that interview.
got to the point where the condition was getting so bad that we actually had a walkout. It was protesting.
That's amazing.
Yes, the whole plant actually walked out without actually thinking about the consequences.
And so Teresa goes on to explain the walkout. She says they walked out because the benefits weren't that good, just the pay. And she talks about the conditions, water and ice soaking workers' legs all day and night, and times without heat. So for her article, Ready, in 1978, interviewed the most vocal leader of the strike, Fred Faust, a knife sharpener who had worked at the plant for 4 years. And Faust puts workers' complaints clearly. He says, quote, "We haven't had a raise in over a year. They just don't respect us. They want everybody to do 2 jobs," end quote. This group of Black workers saw their union as ineffective and took it upon themselves to demand change. Lucy May Collins expressed this sentiment to Ready, quote, "We paid $3 out of each paycheck to the union, and where does it go?" End quote. So this is an event that's not well documented on the public transcript of Athens history. Yet this was a moment of insurgency led by Black workers. And these workers held out for over 3 days. And according to the plant manager at the time, 69 workers lost their jobs. Still, Teresa's memory of the walkout was one marked by excitement and a sense of purpose. She saw her actions and the actions of her coworkers as affecting change, one that impacted her broader community, connecting back to the poor working conditions of her mother's time in the plant, and fast forwarding to the women working in the plant today. And so just a note about this image, it took me a while to find sort of a public record of this walkout that Teresa shared with me. And this is from the plant manager at the time, Cecil Buffington's own personal website. So he has this very colorful personal website documenting from management's perspective 20 years at the plant. And we had some email correspondences before he kind of stopped or cut off communication. Another notable worker struggle took place in 1989 as RWDSU organized at Kegel Inc. in Buena Vista, Georgia. RWDSU built coalitions with non-labor organizations working for economic and social justice. And this is a photo from the campaign. The sender is a group of Black women wearing shirts that say Martin, Jesse, and me. And this union strategy drew on the legacies of the civil rights movement while building local grassroots Black leadership, and continued into the 1990s with the National Poultry Alliance's Freedom Summer 95, led by civil rights leaders Reverend Jesse Jackson and Congressman John Lewis. So throughout this period, unlike other manufacturing sectors in the US, poultry processing experienced continued growth, and Tyson, the industry leader in production, expanded at a rapid pace, opening plants further south in Mexico while increasing the pace and amount of production at home. So these two things were coexisting, right? Worker insurgency and organizing at the same time of industry growth. So Don Tyson, who's pictured here, sets a model and desire to speed up production for the entire industry. This is an interview with the New York Times he did in 1994, where he describes his strategy of selling time. So underlying this logic or this argument of selling time to middle-class families, right, who need to eat further processed chicken, he also talks about this idea he has to get rid of wasted gizzards. So he said he tries to sell what he calls gizzard burgers, first to the Watts neighborhood in South Central LA. And this is again in 1992 after the Rodney King beating and the uprisings that followed. Those quickly flopped. And so he then moved to Arkansas prisons, right, where he tried to sell these to the state and to the incarcerated population. So this logic, I think, it captures kind of the valuation of some people, that's middle class working people who need to save time, right, at the expense of the folks that he's testing this processed food on, not to even mention or think about the workers. So the largest companies continued at this time to vertically integrate, and their profits grew by 14%. Lion speeds increased from 35 birds per minute in 1970 to 91 birds per minute in 1990. And these speed-ups allowed for the rise of processed chicken. So the McNugget, being the prime example of this phenomena, was invented in the early 1990s. And by 2000, 90% of our chicken was sold in pieces. So rather than responding to workers' needs, companies mobilized this labor shortage argument alongside of overused pejoratives of Black workers and a lack of, quote, work ethic to justify a sudden crisis in the industry and the need to recruit different, hardworking workers. The mobilization of welfare reform alongside of heightened anti-Black criminalization and a rapid rise in mass incarceration of the 80s successfully worked to disorganize the insurgent Southern Black working class, to which women poultry plant workers were central. And this crisis paved the way for the largest poultry companies' recruitment of undocumented workers. So Latinx workers were a small part of the poultry industry workforce until the late 1980s. And this map and image are from Angela Stussy and Laura Helton's article from 2013 in Southern Spaces. So by the 1990s, these workers were a quarter of the workforce, and by the 2000s, they made up 75% of the poultry industry workforce. Of course, these workers didn't simply show up, but beginning in the mid-1990s, the largest plants like Tyson, Pilgrims, and Gold Kiss actively recruited undocumented immigrants from Mexico, but also from large Latinx immigrant populations already living within the United States. So on a winter evening in January 2016, I sat down with a librarian and local activist, Aida, who first moved to Athens from Puerto Rico in 1989. Aida is an energetic, warm, and independent advocate for the Latinx community in Athens, and she shared this familiarity with the poultry industry, which she encountered when working with families in the 1990s across Northeast Georgia through Migrant Ed. So I was going to play a clip of that, but I think I'll just read it for time's sake. So Aida says,
yes, yeah, we would ask, how did you came here? They all said that when they were coming over from their countries, usually through Mexico, most of them, they were signs, like in Texas and stuff, that says Georgia Poultry is looking for employees. So they ended up, and it took a few to get here, and then they would tell their family members. So a lot of people came over.
thanks, David. In Northeast Georgia, there are many anecdotal accounts of the plant recruiting workers at flea markets and Sunday soccer leagues, and even distributing false documents from the company's HR office. Between 1990 and 2010, the poultry capital of the world saw its immigrant population increase by 543%. And Georgia tied North Carolina as the top immigrant receiving state during this time. So at the same time, Black workers saw and analyzed these changes firsthand, comparing the newcomers' position to the previous treatment of Black workers in the plants. Again, Ms. Faye Bush is insightful here. She says, quote, "I always say that Blacks and poor whites made Gainesville the chicken capital of the world. And now the Spanish people just are carrying it on," end quote. The cheapened workforce initially served this industry well. My field site union membership in the two largest plants dropped from 80 to 40% in one and dropped down to 50% in the other. Union leadership expressed this drop as, quote, a cultural change, and made assumptions that, quote, Hispanics just simply didn't want to join. But as undocumented migrants began building lives throughout the South, they not only became rooted with families in these communities, but also began to expect and fight for rights as workers and as human beings. And at the national level, large unions like the AFL-CIO, SEIU, and UFCW stood with undocumented immigrants for comprehensive immigration reform for the first time in 2007. While public statements reflected unity, locals across the rural and anti-union South had a more difficult time carrying out the work. This was all happening in Athens. As early as 2006, the local union, UFCW, attempted to bridge Black and Latinx workers and collaborated with a local group, the Economic Justice Coalition, for a union drive at the plant. So Miss Linda Lloyd, who you see here in this photo, is the director of the EJC. She recalled the organizing drive as I sat with her in her cramped office, 2016. She said, quote, The idea was to have a big cookout in both communities, the Black community over at Riverbank off West Main and the Hispanic community out in Evergreen, end quote. This collaboration paid off as UFCW Locals 1996 won the election in September 2006. And of course, this was all happening in Athens, while nationally the largest mass mobilization of undocumented immigrants occurred in May 1st, 2006, when hundreds of thousands of immigrants committed to a general strike. And the strike hit the poultry industry especially hard, as Tyson, Purdue, and Gold Kiss were forced to close 22 plants across the South. Yet 4 months later, ICE conducted several workplace raids, and these raids, along with indictments in some ways, worked to discipline large and small poultry companies from knowingly hiring undocumented immigrants. From interviews with current and former workers, the plants in this region continued to depend on a majority Latinx immigrant workforce from the mid-90s up until 2008 and 2009. Yet as word spread across the plant, undocumented workers were let go or voluntarily left. And this mass exodus may be attributed in part to the ICE raids and the plant's changes in hiring practices, but also to anti-immigrant laws passed across Georgia and other states across the South. Major workforce demographic changes, of course, in the poultry have not simply happened, but are historically shaped by capital and state attempts to discipline worker organizing. So all this history has relevance for today as people briefly turned a collective eye to meat and poultry plants as COVID-19 hotspots. On March 25th, 50 workers walked off the line in Purdue Farms in Kathleen, Georgia, and about 2 hours south in Camilla, Georgia, we heard about the first cases of COVID-19 premature death within poultry processing plants. As 3 Black women workers at Tyson Foods died of COVID-19. Collectively, these women worked at the plant for 77 years. Simultaneous to the first plant deaths, Anthony Cheek became the first incarcerated person to die of COVID-19 inside prison. Cheek, who was 49 years old, had been held in the Lee State Prison near Albany, Georgia, a COVID-19 hotspot. And since then, over 1,000 other incarcerated people have died of COVID-19 related causes, or what activists call death by DOC. In these premature deaths, and as a geographer, someone who thinks about why certain things happen in certain places, I wanted to better understand how hotspots of prisons and poultry plants were connected. And I first started thinking about these connections when the women I worked alongside and recorded talked about their relationships to the prison system, their run-ins with police, and how this shaped their trajectory and decisions to work at the plant. That's what it seems like everyone knows someone. Sorry, so I'll just play this excerpt from an interview with Tamika, who worked in the plant for several years.
Here, because that's all that they have. Really, that will hire mostly Blacks. I'm gonna be honest. Because the poultry is, they will hire you. I'm gonna say it like this: they're lenient. Like if you have a criminal background, if you can't go nowhere else, you can go get a job at a poultry processing plant. So a lot of times you get, a lot of people who got backgrounds and people who you get what I'm saying. They hire just by anybody. And a lot of Hispanics too. But I know a lot of people. My mom worked. My aunt, she worked. She lived next door to me. She worked there she's worked there for years though. But she got a lot of health problems now. She used to work at a poultry plant for some years. I mean, a number of years. And I know a lot of people that still work there.
So in the piece for Monthly Review, I try to draw out relational geographies across plants and prisons. And at the center of this essay, again, I'm thinking with Ruth Wilson Gilmore and her definition of racism as state-sanctioned or extra-legal production and exploitation of group differentiated vulnerability to premature death. And here, racial capitalism structures whose lives are valuable and whose are not, but also what places matter and what places do not through the organization of space and time. So this structural way of understanding life and death helps us understand the connectivity of movements as potential connectivities. And this is something we've learned from the Black radical tradition and is at times emerging within abolitionist movements. That are green, red, and international. Again, quoting from Gilmore. So part of my response here has been a critique of the erasure of Black working people generally and Black women to this workforce specifically into the present. And once we make the connections here, my hope is that the growing movement in defense of Black lives will explicitly inform the labor movement and maybe even expand what that movement looks like. And there are examples of this kind of organizing based across the South with the Southern Workers Assembly, also in Seattle, Washington, through the working group Labor for Black Lives. And I'm hoping in many other places as we see unions defend police and prison CEOs and the challenges this creates for rank and file workers. This is what the General Strike for Abolition in the Civil War did. What Du Bois points out that Black workers, and in that Black workers are not only striking against work, but the very conditions of work that create and enable unfreedom throughout the US and on a global scale. And today, instead of limiting ourselves by asking why workers don't have paid sick time or why line speeds are increasing during a global pandemic, we might also ask both a more simple and complex question. So how do we build a world where, again, quoting Gilmer, life is precious? So undoing that to build that will take much more than a few more dollars an hour or increased protections in a debilitating job at the Poultry. And as Jimmy Boggs reminds us, a job ain't the answer. My research focuses on the carceral geographies tied to concrete things like a criminal record, but also more mundane, everyday things like the logics of time and worker discipline. I begin field work not thinking nearly enough about policing and criminalization, about the expanding carceral geographies that Ruth Wilson Gilmore makes us all pay attention to. And these forms of policing are, of course, place-based and tied to other relations around housing and development, around land, around food access, and more. Yet drawing from this work with Brian Williams and organizers and collaborators here in Athens, Georgia, Black farmers and the children of poultry families like Mike and Sharitha Sheets, artists and organizer like Broderick Flanagan, who we're lucky to work with, and writer and intellectual Nicole Taylor, who's also daughter of a poultry plant worker. Members of groups like Free the Mall Washington and groups like the Poor People's Movement, the Economic Justice Coalition, and finally, Comrade Lawrence Jenkins, who is an incarcerated Black farmer in Washington State. They've all helped me to think about and conceptualize these broader connections across food, abolition, and labor. I hope we can think with these movements to transform carceral geographies through reparative relations to land and each other. And I'm going to conclude by sharing a clip by Lawrence Jenkins. I shared this in a food and abolition panel, but he's encouraged me to share it here today, and I hope we can continue to build these lines of connectivity.
I found farming when I was in trouble as a youth and sent to a group home that sat on a small ranch. I was too young to work in the community, so I was assigned to be the animal keeper as some form of disciplinary punishment. Being that I'm from Seattle, the assumption was that this experience would somehow break me. In opposite, it was the best experience I ever had in my life because I always had a love for nature and animals, but never had a real opportunity to make this connection until that point in my life. I learned how to raise animals, grow crops, and run a farmer's market, but my experience there was short-lived. I went back to the city and ended up getting involved in more crimes for economic survival and going to prison for armed robbery at the age of 18. It wasn't until I came back to prison at the age of 23 when the prison food system was switching over to all processed foods when I started to see a real purpose for the knowledge and skills I learned at the ranch. It felt good to be able to show up in a different way to deal with the food problem in prison. While building greenhouses, hoop houses, aquaponic systems, and installing commercial composting bins, I remember thinking hard about my life and the struggle my family and community had to face to put food on the table. And here I was in the penitentiary building a community food system. Up until that point, I did not know about George Washington Carver and his contributions to regenerative agriculture. I did not know what sharecropping was or what a cooperative was, or that nearly 14 million acres were stolen and 14 million acres of land were stolen and dispossessed from Black farmers. I did not know what indigenous farm practices were. The part that messed with me the most is that the only depictions of my ancestors working on farms that I ever seen in my life up until that point were all gruesome images of slave plantations in settings that looked identical to the setting where I had to build an alternative food system for prisoners. It took me many years to overcome internalized racism and oppression to the point where I could feel solid with this work. I had to go back through African history and find myself. Amilcar Cabral's Unity and Struggle and Decolonization and Resistance is what helped me center my knowledge in revolutionary practice, especially as a farmer and a revolutionary.
So with Lawrence's words, I think I'll end there, and I'm down to answer questions and continue the conversation. Thanks, y'all.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Carrie, for running through that really special history and providing us with the historical context and tying it to some of the struggles today. Just for context for those listening in, we have a cohort of folks that have met every month on different topics brought to us by the scholars and historians, and we were able to develop questions for you. And these people who are joining the cohort are organizers, involved in social movements, artists, cultural workers, that kind of thing. So I'm opening up the YouTube chat. Please put your questions in here, and I'll also ask some questions to you, Carrie. But just to start off, we are curious. So I would love to actually hear a little bit more about you, your background and what led you to study this, to organize here location-wise, and as we read it, worked in the factories as well.
Yeah, that's a great question. So yeah, like I said at the beginning, I'm born and raised in Georgia, grew up in the northwest part of the state. And as you can probably tell from my last name, and I'm adopted into a very large family by two white parents, but siblings largely from Asia and Latinx countries, right? So sorry, I'm not phrasing this very well, but I grew up in rural Northwest Georgia, seeing kind of the job opportunities and things that were available to my brothers and sisters and I. And I went away to college at the height of the world food crisis and finished up my studies in 2008, 2009, and was reflecting on the place where I came from, the major economic paths for development in that region, and the job opportunities still available to most of my siblings who remained in fast food work and service industry, and had one brother who worked as a grower, helping as a farmhand on one of the poultry growing out operations, right? And poultry dominated that region and dominated the ways that people thought about the future of the place. But I also was constantly, I guess, troubled by questions of race and white supremacy in the region and where I was raised and how I was raised in a lot of ways. It took going away to college and to grad school in upstate New York and learning from radical scholars. Dr. Clem Lai introduced me to Robin Kelly's work, Hammer and Hoe, which told a very different story of the Black radical South, and one that I wanted to understand more deeply because it was a story and a history that I didn't see present in my upbringing. And then through the research and returning to Georgia and trying to understand questions of race and food in that moment took me back to the poultry industry and back to the region, although in the northeastern part of the state. And working alongside of people there, organizers, several immigrant rights organizers in the region, and the Economic Justice Coalition, and many workers on the line, I've begun to rethink the stories we tell about growth and job creation and the American dream, right? And so you asked also about the ethnography. I worked in the plant, got hired in this plant for 6 months, and I chose that plant because it is one of the largest in the state. It's very typical in having both an evisceration and debone side. And I was hired as a regular line worker, um, doing somewhat covert research that was not actually approved by my university's IRB, or it was dismissed as not really rigorous research, right? So I think a lot of folks doing ethnographic or work or doing oral history work, many IRBs don't really consider that real research, right? And being employed at the plant 6 months, I think people outside of the industry and outside of this place think that it's like quite a tremendous feat or something. But the women that I worked alongside of and eventually interviewed, they joked, that's your little time at the Poultry. So that's always a very humbling thing to remember. And so in the presentations I do and in the book, I try to really emphasize their oral histories and stories rather than that ethnography. But I did learn a lot about the pace of work, the production day, the forms of labor discipline that happen inside the plant, the ways that workers are sort of kept in time with the line speed itself, but also the ways in which people really organize in small P politics ways, right? In caring for one another and feeding one another, and fundraising for one another in hard times. And so I think that's another piece that was really important about working inside the plant.
Thanks for sharing your story, Carrie. I'd actually love to hear a little bit more about that time piece and its connection to racial capitalist logic. I know you've expanded a bit about this in the pieces that you had, but I'd love to hear more about that here. How is it sold, exploited, utilized here? And I have a follow-up question after.
Yeah, the timepiece. I mean, I'm thinking with W.E.B. Du Bois and the Souls of Black Folk, he has this chapter on agriculture in the Black Belt South, and particularly cotton. And he talks or focuses on his observations in Dougherty County, Georgia. And there he's following this produce truck, and he sees, food fall off the truck, like pieces of corn. And he notices the Black workers there don't scramble to catch it, right? And he's in his observation, he comments, to the car window sociologist, the person just driving by studying what he calls the snarl of centuries, the intersection of race and plantation agriculture. In a snapshot, might understand those workers as being lazy and shiftless, as not caring about the product or the productivity of their labor. But then he goes on to say, if you follow these young workers beyond this moment, right, you'll see that how much they work to produce food for themselves and their families, and how this is an act of not raising money for the white man, the white plantation owner. And so I say all that to think about the use of time and the resistance of a plantation sort of dominant time sense that he was observing and thinking about. And of course, I think about his words alongside of historian E.P. Thompson, who also talks about the need for capitalists to constantly discipline workers, and to do that through a control of their sense of time. But what I saw on the line, right, we think often about time in the poultry plant as being tied to these policies created by the USDA, by the Food Service Inspection Services, that really determine the speed and pace of production. But what I also saw was the, workers' ability to slow down, not production itself, but slow down the effects of the pace of work on their bodies, for themselves, or for the people that they're working alongside of. I also kind of got schooled in this time sense, right? Like not killing yourself to keep production for the owners of the plant, for profits that you'll never see. And this is not a new observation, right? I think Robin Kelley and folks like Tara Hunter and others think about this as small acts of resistance, as a political sort of infrapolitics, is what Robin Kelley calls it, right? But I'm also thinking of it on a larger scale as a practice of a practice that is racialized, and that we might think with folks like Du Bois and Thompson, even Linebaugh and Kelley together, to think about how we resist these capitalist modes of time and how our time is produced and kept and managed and supervised. I guess I'll stop there.
Yeah, and I think you've somewhat answered my next question, but maybe you want to expand on it more. How do you think that time is being discussed today in our current labor movement struggles, whether it's between workers or when we're organizing workers? How is time discussed, and how can we engage with workers on this concept, but like in a not abstract way?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think about it, I guess, in terms of, we can think about it in relation to the length of the working day. We can think about it, in the fight for people to have more control over their own time. But I'm thinking also about, like I mentioned in the talk, James Boggs' comment, "A job ain't the answer." And so James Bogg was a auto worker from Marion Junction, Alabama, who moved to Detroit and was a part of Black worker organizing in Detroit. He's also an intellectual, and I feel like such an influence on the way that I think about work and capitalism and race. But he wrote "A Job Ain't the Answer" in response to mechanization and speed ups and automation within the auto industry, saying that the solution is not only to make incremental improvements within a workplace where you never own the fruits of your labor, right? But to rethink sort of our relationship to work and our relationship to the time we spend working for another. And I know that this sounds very simplistic, and of course, cooperatives might be the answer there, but I think that what, to me, this speaks to is that, the ability to build alternatives to the relation we have to capital and labor relation that we currently have, right, is to etch out more control for individual and community time to do the things that that are threatened through a productivist logic, like we see with with plantation agriculture and all the ways that it sort of fought against or disallowed like other ways of living, relating to one another in the land, growing food, etc. So I think that there's a way to bring cooperative movements, the cooperatively owned factory, the cooperatively owned daycare center, right, alongside of or with movements that are also thinking about our relations to land and the production of food. And I guess we can see this in places like Jackson, Mississippi, with Cooperation Jackson. I think we also see it I saw it very concretely in Athens with the creation of worker-owned cooperatives and the EJC. But it is difficult when we're thinking about the question of scale, and that's something I struggle with. And I wish this was more interactive so that we could hear from folks who are doing this work in different places as well.
Thank you, Carrie, for sharing that. I have a question about, you mentioned the history of the UFCW, the Black and Latinx kind of almost coalition building and the cookout that was happened, and how there's a predominant narrative in poultry work that it's mostly Latinx and how it's mostly immigrants, but actually what you saw in your field work, it's majority US-born Black workforce. Um, how do you think that this narrative that it's mostly Latinx workers, immigrant workers, how is that dividing up our class struggle here to organize together? And why and how did that narrative get perpetuated?
That's a really difficult question. A great question, though. I think, I guess one thing that I saw, I guess, in academic writing about the industry, right, is there's a lag in when things get put out. And this is just a very technical, logistical issue of the stories that we tell and how they find their way to the wider public. But many of the studies that are focused, and beautiful and powerful studies focused on the role of largely undocumented Latinx workers in the industry, were done in the 90s and early 2000s and then published, quite recently, right? And so I think there might be a little lag in information that helps reproduce this story of what was actually happening 20 years ago. But I also think of more difficult to sort of capture or quantify or show, but there's this also sense of, at least what I saw in my field work, there's strong divisions between Black worker organizing and Latinx immigrant rights organizing, at least in the site that I was at, not because of the individuals themselves, but there's a sense of paternalism that sort of happens among organizers and sites, particularly the relationship, I think, of well-meaning white folks and immigrant rights organizing. And underlying all of that is this unsettled relationship of whiteness and anti-Blackness in these places that's never fully dealt with or addressed. I think more recently, at least within Athens, there have been organizing drives to redress the role of UGA in forced displacement of Black communities. There has been, because of the movement in defense of Black lives that we've seen over the last 6-7 years, right, has really pushed the conversations within that particular place. But I will say that I think the divisions are often created alongside of these narratives of hard work, of deservingness, of innocence that are placed by outsiders onto a lot of the immigrant rights organizing in that place, right? And so to overcome those divisions, there also has to be a redress of anti-Blackness in those movements. And Angela Stussey's work in Mississippi, I think, provides a really concrete example of an attempt by a worker center to do that reconciliation and redress through a group called Empower. It's a Mississippi poultry organizing, Mississippi poultry worker organizing group or center, right? It was not a formal union, but they did have these power and oppression workshops, and they did try to share think about the intersections of plantation agriculture, the transatlantic slave trade, to the production of the Mississippi poultry industry. But I think that's really rare, rare practice, especially in more rural places across the U.S. South. So that's another sort of huge barrier. Yeah, I think I'll stop there.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. And I think to expand on that, you talked about, with the erasure of Black working women in these narratives currently, you are hoping for, envisioning for a future in which the labor movement and the Black Lives Matter movement and work, there's more of a synergy between this organizing. What's your vision for that? How do you want to see that flourish, come to be?
Yeah, well, I guess, I have ideas, but I think these movements are taking place in parts of the country, regardless of what my ideas are, right? So I do think the Southern Workers Assembly is one example of an organization that's trying to reach its geographic spread out of North Carolina, with some really incredible organizers. They had a whole session on meat and poultry worker organizing last year, the height of the pandemic. They even created a worker handbook, and they had, prioritized Black and Latinx workers on several panels to inform the writing of that handbook and the kinds of organizing that they're trying to build across the South. I also think for the labor movement, I think it's really powerful for us to build against what Ruth Wilson Gilmore calls the problem of innocence. And we can think about that in terms of prison abolition work, right? So we often, with that work, people are starting to be more clear on this problem of innocence, right? Like ranking people who should be incarcerated for life and those who should never be in prison and should have pathways to more restorative forms of justice and healing. But I think how that might translate to the labor movement is also applying the same kind of logic to this hierarchy of workers that often I think is reproduced in our mass media, and the ideas of who's deserving of a fair wage, right? Who's deserving of worker protections, and often people with criminal records are not included in these organizing drives. I think they're workers who don't stay committed to one place for a long amount of time, right, are often excluded from these drives, and also miss the already sort of weak net in the South of labor organizing and union organizing. So, again, it's not just, the ideas that I have about bringing these movements together, but I do and hope that and see them taking place in some places of the U.S. South. Again, I'll speak to, work in Atlanta, like Abiodun Henderson and the Come Up Project is really fighting for both a living wage for youth who participate in this urban farm program. So there's this very clear labor component in fighting for more than 15 an hour, but also at the same time thinking about pathways for formerly incarcerated youth to be a part of a living and thriving community. So yeah, I think I'll end there with those few examples. Yeah.
Thank you for sharing about the movement work already happening in the South around this. And please do send us those names and ways in which we can plug in to those groups as well. I have a question in the chat about, within the factories themselves, what kind of health effects have you observed due to this kind of work? I know Tamika was mentioning some of that as well.
Yeah, that's a great question. So there are large OSHA studies and GAO, Government Accountability Office studies of this industry that document worker-reported injury and illness rates, right? So these are studies when a worker files an official complaint to their nurse's office and to the supervisor. And so officially those should be filed. And so the poultry industry up until the 90s had some of the largest rates of injury and illness of all manufacturing. And the industry itself sort of applauds their work in decreasing the rate of injury and illness from starting in the 90s and sort of plateauing. And those rates of injury and illness are often musculoskeletal disorders, forms of carpal tunnel, cuts, knife injuries, things like that. But again, those are all the sort of official record of what workers experience on the Lyme. And I think so much is underreported because in the plant, there's one nurse who's definitely or at least what I saw, sided with the plant itself. And if you get a referral out to a doctor, that's a plant appointed doctor in the community who receives a majority of the referrals from the plant. So you can't go to your own private doctor, your own family physician. So again, I think this leads to a good amount of underreporting of injury and illness. And just anecdotally, or some might think it's anecdotal, I think these stories are super important and powerful testimonies of the effects of work. But from several workers, we recently talked with one woman who worked in the plant for 3.5 years, and she had 2 heart attacks while working at the plant. One was actually on the line. I've talked to women who've had miscarriages because they think the stress and pace of work caused their miscarriage. There are all sorts of issues with slipping and falling in the plant because of the wetness of the floor, the need constantly to be spraying water to clean up the facility. So those are just some of the, I guess, stories from workers that I've seen and noted in my work. But again, there is the official transcript of what's happening and how great the industry is doing to alleviate injury and illness, and then what workers repeatedly express and tell not only me, but to other worker centers and projects across Arkansas, Mississippi, and Georgia, North Carolina. So I guess that's all to say, like, how do we better, document and showcase or report those sorts of injuries that are underreported, while at the same time, so many people outside of the industry know that the industry is terrible and know that the industry mistreats workers and have some vague sense of the racial politics or reliance on Black and brown workers, right? So I'm also curious with that question, like what are the other stories that we can tell to change the conditions of that, not only the conditions of the work, but also our reliance on such degraded work that leads to all these sorts of injuries and illness that workers are sharing. So thank you for that question.
Yeah, thanks, Carrie, for sharing that. And I guess this makes me also think, the cycle of, that how destructive the industry is and how there's perception of it. It makes me think of that connection between factories and prisons and that cycle as well. Can you expand a little bit more on that? I know you obviously talked about it in your talk. Expand on that connection, and also how much are workers aware of this, both historically and in their present context today?
Yeah, so I'm working with some really incredible people here in Athens now on a film project, kind of thinking about the relationship of Black Athens and the poultry industry. And what I've learned from this collaboration with Nicole Taylor, especially, and interviewing her mother and other women of her mother's generation, right, who went into the plant in the 70s and 80s and worked, several decades at that place. There is a very different sort of path to upward mobility that was somewhat possible in the early days of working at the plant, right? And this is a long way to answer your question about incarceration and the relationship to criminalization, but there are different generations of workers, and I want to be clear that there's an older generation that seems to have been able to afford to buy homes and establish themselves within Athens, a pathway to somewhat middle class livelihood, right? But then you see later generations and having less access to those pathways, right? And we can think of that in terms of the general decline of the actual real payments that people are getting or receiving, right? Those rates have dropped drastically. Unionization rates have dropped drastically. But also I want to think about that alongside of increased incarceration rates in the state of Georgia, and across the country, beginning really in the 1980s and exploding in the 1990s. And so that younger generations of workers that I talk to who are, mid 40s and below, most of those interviews with women, they talked about their contact with the criminal system, right? So with police in their communities, their own incarceration, and how that's impacted their ability to find work. And the poultry in this region becomes one of the few places to get a job if you have a record. And we saw that, in the interview that I shared. But I think this also speaks not only to the poultry's individualistic relationship to incarceration, but also the pathway for development for this region for working class people more generally, right? The other jobs available to folks are fast food, maybe Home Depot or Walmart, but those jobs pay considerably less than the poultry. So there's still this relationship of economic opportunity within rural places of the U.S. South that are quite dismal for working people. And then alongside of a rate of increased incarceration and policing within communities creates the poultry as this good shitty job, if that makes any sense, right? It pays much higher than most of those other places. You have benefits, right? And so I think that that's something that workers expressed time and time again, that they were grateful for the opportunity to work in a high-paying place, but they hated the job and the work, right? And it doesn't keep people for long, which impacts the kinds of labor organizing possible. And I think ideas about, more general ideas about deservingness and criminality still shape not only labor organizing, but other kinds of social movement organizing that might connect with union drives and other things within the plant. That makes sense. But yeah, thanks for that question.
Yeah, thank you. That context is helpful for us as we think about this connection that you've made through your history as an exploration. There's a question that we developed that hopefully puts us on a future forward thinking seat. You went through some of the histories of successful walkouts, and how likely is it now for communities in poultry factories to organize and to strike? What's needed for it, and what do you see for its future?
Yeah, what a great question. Well, recently, last March, I noted the walkout in Kathleen, Georgia. There have been a few other documented workouts across the state in response to COVID-19, and these feel somewhat spontaneous, right? Even like in Teresa's interview, she says, we protested, we didn't think about the consequences, but we did it, and it was good and bad for the workers at that time, 1978. But I think the answer there is not, oh, they didn't have union support, so it was a bad action, but instead to think about the kinds of relationships they had to have had with each other and the trust they had to have had with each other for all those workers and at least 69 workers to walk out, and all those workers were terminated, right? So I think there's a story there that is worth thinking about in the present with the Kathleen, Georgia walkout, and the 50 workers who walked out there. And we've seen insurgencies across the U.S. South and across the country. I think Cornell ILR School is actually tracing or tracking those worker insurgencies. And so the kinds of support that people need in these times I'm thinking again that, you know, the Southern Workers Assembly probably has much to say about what that's looking like in places like North Carolina. I know in Washington State there was an attempt to organize in Eastern Washington, and there was this really beautiful moment of community orgs, both religious, like faith-based, and racial justice groups in the area, who supported the workers as best they could to mobilize and demand better conditions in response to COVID-19. And so all that to say that I think COVID-19 provides this moment where people are thinking about the industry in new ways and thinking about quote unquote essential workers in new ways, right? But to sustain that community support is a much harder question. And I'm hoping, you know, people in the chat who are part of community organizing in the South and remain tied to worker centers like the one being built hopefully here in Athens, Georgia, can begin to answer those questions. But they do depend upon much longer established relationships to one another that exist in spite of formal unions. And you know, I think for the South especially, unions have been so undercut through right to work laws that transforming those laws also might be a really good federal and state level step to strengthen the organizing that is taking place in the few plants that are formally organized. So thinking both with sort of communities and the ways that they might organize creatively in response to COVID-19 that exist or persist outside of the workplace, and at the same time strengthening the possibilities for labor union organizing by undoing right to work laws. But those are huge asks, right? Requires all sorts of mobilizations, and both at the grassroots and at legislative levels.
Yes, thanks, Carrie, for sharing that. And we look to the history that you've been uncovering as a way to anchor the organizing that's being done today. It provides really important context for those organizing workers in the South now. Is there anything else that you'd want to share to those tuning in and those who are going to be able to watch this live stream later as an educational, political educational part of their work?
I'm excited about people and groups organizing for prison abolition and labor movements, and I'd love to hear more if you're doing that somewhere, and if you want to reach out and connect. There is an emergent group in Washington State that's trying to do that, and actually kicked the police union out of the labor council, which is sort of like it's this really great public gesture. And it was led by rank and file workers. And right now we're trying to build out that movement, and with and alongside of incarcerated workers. So if you're a part of anything like that, I'd love to connect and hear more about it and connect our movements. But yeah, thanks so much for letting me be here and spend so much time with y'all today.
Thank you so much, Carrie. And someone wrote to us in the chat, thanks so much for this very thoughtful research and writing. They appreciate the historical references and the revolutionary optimism. We're looking forward to reading your book and your work when it's out. And thank you again for joining us today. This lecture, as well as our other lectures, are all available on our YouTube. It will also be soon up on our political education resource platform, which is politicaleducation.peoplesforum.org. So the series will be available for you to share with your organizations, to share with your fellow organizers. We're really grateful for the scholars and historians who have shared with us the work that they've been doing and the histories they've been uncovering, because this is what is going to not forestall our future victories. We learn from our history. Thank you, Carrie. Thank you, everybody who's tuned in today. And we will talk soon. Bye.